Everyone warned the little girl that pigs would ruin the land. They warned her with the kind of certainty that only adults possess, the kind of certainty that comes from decades of watching things fail and never questioning why. They warned her at the feed store, where the men gathered around the coffee pot and shook their heads at the sight of her father's truck loaded with piglets. They warned her at the church potluck, where the casseroles grew cold while the women clucked their tongues and whispered about the Crawford girl and her crazy ideas. They warned her at the school bus stop, where the older children pointed at the muddy field behind her house and laughed about the pig farm that was going to smell worse than the Henderson place. And they warned her at the town council meeting, where Mr. Harrelson stood up with his spreadsheets and his soil samples and announced to the room that allowing pigs to root freely on a hillside was not farming, it was ecological suicide. But 8-year-old Lila Crawford did not listen. She stood in the middle of the dead brown field that her grandfather had abandoned 15 years ago, her boots sinking into soil that had been compacted by decades of corn and soybeans until it was as hard as concrete. And she watched the first piglet, a spotted Hampshire cross she had named Rosie, bury her snout in the earth and begin to dig. The soil flew in dark arcs, scattering across the dry grass, exposing the pale clay beneath. Lila smiled, because Lila Crawford knew something that Mr. Harrelson did not. She knew that the pigs were not destroying the land. They were waking it up. And in 18 months, the hillside that everyone said would be ruined and would be so green, so alive, so impossibly transformed that the same people who warned her would drive from 3 counties away just to see it with their own eyes. This is the story of one little girl's impossible faith, a hillside that had forgotten how to breathe, and the pigs who taught an entire town that sometimes the most destructive force in nature is actually the most creative. It is a story about the difference between ruin and renewal, about the wisdom of trusting what the experts call foolishness, and about the 8-year-old who saw life where everyone else saw only death. Lila had grown up in the yellow farmhouse at the top of Willow Creek Road, the house with the sagging porch and the tire swing that her father had hung from the old oak tree when she was 4. Her father, Thomas Crawford, was a man who had inherited a farm that was slowly dying beneath his feet. The soil, once rich and black and alive with earthworms, had been reduced by years of chemical fertilizers and heavy machinery to something that looked like dust and felt like stone. The corn yields had dropped every season for a decade. The soybeans grew stunted and yellow, their roots unable to penetrate the hard pan that had formed 6 inches below the surface. And the back hillside, 40 acres of sloping land that had once been pasture for her grandfather's dairy herd, was now a wasteland of bare clay and dead grass, eroding a little more with every rain, sending streams of brown water into the creek below. Thomas had done what the agricultural extension agents told him to do. He had tilled deeper. He had added more fertilizer. He had planted cover crops that died before they could establish roots. He had spent $20,000 on a new disc harrow that was supposed to break up the hard pan, and he had watched it bounce off the soil like a hammer striking anvil. The hillside remained dead. The creek remained brown. And Thomas, who had once loved farming with a passion that made him whistle while he worked, had begun to hate the sight of his own land. Lila noticed. She noticed the way her father's shoulders slumped when he walked back from the fields. She noticed the way he stopped inviting neighbors to see the farm, stopped entering the county fair, stopped talking about the future. She noticed the way he stared at the hillside through the kitchen window, his coffee growing cold in his hands, his eyes empty of the light that had once made him laugh at her knock-knock jokes. And she decided with the absolute certainty that only children possess that she would fix it. The idea came from a book, not a textbook. Lila was only in 3rd grade, and textbooks bored her, but a children's book about a farm in England where pigs had been used to clear bracken and restore heathland. The book was called Pigs Save the Day, and Lila had found it in the free box at the library's annual book sale, its cover torn and its pages stained with what looked like chocolate. She read it 17 times in one weekend, curled up in the tire swing with a flashlight after her father thought she was asleep. The book told the story of a farmer who had been told that pigs would destroy his land, who had been warned that their rooting would cause erosion and their manure would pollute the water, but who had discovered that the pigs' natural behavior, their digging, their wallowing, their constant movement across the landscape was actually a form of biological engineering that no machine could replicate. The pigs, the book explained, broke up compacted soil with their snouts, creating channels for water and air to penetrate. Their manure, far from being pollution, was a rich fertilizer that fed the soil microbiome, the invisible ecosystem of bacteria and fungi that made plants grow. Their wallows created small ponds that collected rainwater and provided habitat for frogs and insects. And their constant movement, driven by their instinct to forage, meant that they never stayed in one place long enough to overgraze or overfertilize. They were not destroyers. They were gardeners with hooves and snouts and an intelligence that humans had forgotten to respect. Lila brought the book to her father on a Sunday morning in March, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the wind carried the smell of rain. She climbed onto his lap in the recliner, something she had not done since she was 5, and opened the book to the page with the photograph of the green hillside. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but steady, "I want to do this. I want to fix the back hill, with pigs." Thomas looked at the book. He looked at his daughter, her face serious and hopeful, her hair tangled from sleep. He looked at the photograph of the English hillside, green and lush and alive, and he felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in years. But he also felt the weight of every failure, every wasted dollar, every broken promise that the land had made and broken. "Lila," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "pigs are expensive. And the neighbors, you know what they would say. Mr. Harrelson already thinks I am a fool for keeping this farm. If I fill the back hill with pigs, he will have me run out of the county. Then do not tell him," Lila said simply. "Not yet. Just let me try, with a few. Please, Daddy. I have $43 from my birthday. I will buy the first one, and if it does not work, I will never ask again." Thomas looked at her for a long time. He saw his mother's stubbornness in her jaw, his father's hope in her eyes. He saw the little girl who had once planted a sunflower in the driveway and watered it every day until it grew taller than the mailbox. The little girl who had refused to give up on a baby bird that had fallen from its nest, nursing it with an eyedropper until it could fly. He sighed, a sound that came from deep in his chest, and he folded the book. 5 piglets, he said, that is all, and they stay on the back hill where nobody can see them from the road. And if Mr. Harrelson finds out, we blame it on a 4-H project. Deal? Lila threw her arms around his neck and squeezed until he could not breathe. The piglets arrived on a Saturday in April, delivered in the back of a truck driven by a farmer named Joe, who raised heritage breeds in the next county, and who looked at Lila with amusement when she climbed into the bed to help unload them. "Your daddy know what he is doing?" Joe asked, handing down a spotted piglet that squirmed and squealed in Lila's arms. "He will," Lila said, and she carried Rosie, the first piglet, the one with the black spot over her left eye, to the dead hillside and set her down on the brown grass. She sniffed the air. She dug her snout into the hard soil, grunted with effort, and began to root. The earth, which had resisted tractors and disc harrows and every tool Thomas owned, yielded to her snout like butter. Dark clods flew in every direction. Within minutes, Rosie had created a hole 6 inches deep, exposing soil that had not seen sunlight in 15 years. Lila sat down in the grass and watched. She watched Rosie root. She watched the other 4 piglets, Buster, Daisy, Hamlet, and Petunia, join in, their snouts working the soil with a rhythm that looked like dancing. She watched the dead hillside begin to move, to breathe, to come alive in a way that no machine had ever managed. And she smiled. The first warning came from Mrs. Gable, who taught Sunday school and who had known Lila since she was born. She drove past the farm on her way to the grocery store, saw the piglets in the back field, and turned her car around to knock on the door. "Thomas," she said, her voice tight with concern, "I saw the pigs. Lila's pigs. You cannot let her do this. Pigs root. They destroy pasture. They create mud wallows that breed disease. I read an article the extension office says free-range pigs cause more erosion than any other livestock. She is 8 years old, Thomas. She does not understand what she is doing." Thomas stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, and he felt the old familiar weight of doubt pressing down on his shoulders. "It is just 5, Mrs. Gable, a 4-H project. Lila is learning responsibility." "Responsibility?" Mrs. Gable's voice rose. "She is learning how to destroy your land. That hillside is already eroding. Those pigs will turn it into a mudslide waiting to happen. Mark my words, Thomas. By July, you will have gullies where you used to have grass. And the smell. Have you thought about the smell? The Hendersons live downwind. They will sue you." Thomas thanked her for her concern and closed the door. But the words stayed with him, worming into his mind like the doubts that had already cost him so much sleep. He walked to the back field that evening and stood at the fence watching the piglets root. They had been there for 3 days, and already the ground looked different. Not better, not yet, but different. The soil was turned, exposed, raw. It looked to his worried eyes like destruction, like ruin, like everything Mrs. Gable had warned him about Lila. He said that night at dinner, pushing his mashed potatoes around his plate, "Maybe we should move the pigs to the barn, where they cannot do so much damage." Lila looked up from her book, her eyes wide and steady. "They are not damaging, Daddy. They are digging. There is a difference. You have to dig before you can plant. You have to break before you can build." Thomas stared at her. She was 8 years old. She had never taken a soil science class. She had never read the extension reports or attended the workshops or sat in the meetings where men in suits explained why the land was dying. But she had understood something that he had missed. She had understood that the soil was not dead. It was only sleeping, and the pigs were its alarm clock. By June, the warnings had become a chorus. Mr. Harrelson, who served on the county soil conservation board and who had made it his life's mission to prevent exactly the kind of experiment that Lila was conducting, drove his pickup to the farm and stood at the fence with a clipboard and a camera. "Thomas," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I am documenting this for the board. The erosion on your back hillside has increased by 40% since April. The sediment load in Willow Creek has doubled. Your daughter's pigs are creating wallows that are breeding grounds for parasites. And the smell. I have had 3 complaints from neighbors. I am required to inform you that if this continues, the county can issue a cease and desist order. For the good of the watershed, Lila, who had been hiding behind the barn, stepped out into the open. She was wearing her grandfather's old boots, which were too big and made her walk like a duck, and her face was streaked with mud from where she had been helping Rosie dig a new wallow. She walked up to Mr. Harrelson and stood in front of him, her chin raised, her eyes unblinking. "The erosion is from the rain," she said, "not the pigs. The rain always makes mud, and the creek is brown because the soil was already dead. The pigs did not make it dead. They are making it alive." Mr. Harrelson looked down at her, his expression softening slightly in the way that adults' expressions do when they are about to explain to a child why she is wrong. "Little girl," he said, "I have a master's degree in soil science from Purdue University. I have been working in conservation for 30 years. I know what I am talking about. Pigs destroy land. That is not an opinion. That is a fact." Lila did not back down. "My book says pigs used to clear forest in Europe. They used to make farmland in England. They used to." "Your book," Mr. Harrelson interrupted, "is a children's story. This is real life, and in real life, pigs ruin land. I am sorry, but that is the truth." He drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled on Lila's hair and shoulders like a gray shroud. Thomas walked over and knelt beside her, his knees cracking in the dry air. "Lila," he said, his voice rough, "maybe he is right. Maybe this was a mistake. We can still sell the pigs to the processor. We would not lose too much money, and then we could try something else. Something the experts approve of." Lila looked at her father, and in his eyes she saw the same fear that had killed the land, the fear of trying, the fear of failing, the fear of being laughed at by people who claim to know better. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his large ones. "Daddy," she said, "you told me once that Grandpa used to say the land speaks, but most people forgot how to listen. I am listening. The pigs are listening. Please. Just until September. If the hill is not better by September, I will help you sell them." "I promise." Thomas looked at the hillside. It did not look better. It looked worse, torn up, muddy, raw, but beneath the surface where his eyes could not see, something was happening. He could feel it in his bones, the same way his father had felt rain coming 3 days before the clouds appeared. He squeezed Lila's hand. "September," he said. "But if Mr. Harrelson comes back with that clipboard, you are the one who has to talk to him." I am done making excuses. July arrived with a heat that made the air shimmer and the cicadas scream. The piglets were no longer piglets. They had grown into young pigs. Their bodies round and muscular, their snouts powerful enough to flip rocks the size of footballs. Lila had expanded their territory, using portable electric fencing to move them across the hillside in a rotation that mimicked the movement of wild herds. Every 2 weeks, she would take down the fence, call the pigs with a bucket of corn, and set up a new paddock on a fresh section of the dead field. The old paddock left behind looked like a battlefield, mud and holes and scattered manure. The warnings continued. The neighbors stopped waving when Thomas drove past. The feed store owner refused to extend credit, citing concerns about the farm's viability. Even Lila's teacher, who had once praised her creativity, pulled her aside after school and asked if everything was okay at home, her voice dripping with the kind of concern that meant she had heard the rumors. But Lila did not waver. She woke every morning at 6, before the heat, and walked the hillside with her notebook, the same spiral-bound notebook that had once held her math homework, now filled with observations that no third grader should have been making. She recorded the depth of the rooting, the color of the soil, the number of earthworms she found in each square foot. She collected manure samples and mixed them with water, watching the liquid turn dark with nutrients. She planted seeds, clover, rye, vetch, in the freshly turned soil, seeds that her father said would never grow in such a mess. Seeds that she watered with a can she carried from the creek, and she waited. August was the hardest month. The heat peaked, the rain stopped, and the hillside looked like something from a nightmare. The pigs' wallows had dried into cracked clay bowls. The manure, baking in the sun, smelled like ammonia and decay. The seeds Lila had planted had sprouted, tiny, fragile, barely visible, but the heat was killing them, one by one, until only the strongest remained. Mr. Harrelson drove past twice, his camera clicking, his clipboard filling with evidence of what he called agricultural disaster. Thomas stopped walking to the back field. He could not bear to look at it, to see his daughter's hope dying in the dust. He threw himself into the front fields, where the corn was failing and the soybeans were yellow, because at least there he knew what to expect. At least there the failure was familiar. But Lila did not stop. She carried water to the remaining seedlings, bucket by bucket, her arms aching, her skin burning. She moved the pigs to the shadiest part of the hill, where a stand of old hickory trees provided some relief from the sun. She sang to them, old songs her mother had sung, songs about rain and growing things, and she told them stories about the green hillside that was coming, that was almost here, that was waiting just around the corner of September. And then, on the last day of August, it rained, not a thunderstorm, not a downpour, but a gentle, steady rain that fell for 3 days and 3 nights, soaking into the earth with a patience that matched Lila's own. The rain filled the wallows, turning them into ponds that sparkled in the gray light. It softened the manure, releasing nutrients that had been locked in the dry crust. It woke the seeds that had been sleeping, waiting, holding on. And on the morning of September 3rd, Lila walked to the back field and saw something that made her drop her bucket and fall to her knees. Green, not the pale, sickly green of the front field's failing crops, but a deep, vibrant, impossible green that spread across the hillside like a wave. The clover had taken hold, its roots diving into the channels the pigs had created, its leaves spreading in a carpet that covered the bare clay. The rye stood tall, its stalks thick and strong, its heads heavy with grain. The vetch had climbed the scattered weeds, turning them into pillars of purple flowers, and beneath it all, in the soil that the pigs had turned and fertilized and aerated, earthworms writhed by the thousands, their bodies glistening, their work just beginning. Lila ran to the house, her boots slipping in the mud, her voice screaming before she reached the door. "Daddy, Daddy, come look, come look!" Thomas was at the kitchen table, his coffee cold, his eyes red from another sleepless night. He heard his daughter's voice, not the voice of a child playing, but the voice of someone who had seen a miracle, and he ran. He ran out the door, across the yard, through the gate, and he stopped at the edge of the back field, his breath catching in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hillside was green. Not just green, alive. The clover had spread so thick that it looked like a lawn, a carpet, a promise kept. The rye swayed in the breeze, its golden heads catching the morning sun. The vetch flowers hummed with bees, more bees than Thomas had seen in a decade, their bodies fat with pollen. And the pigs, Rosie and Buster and Daisy and Hamlet and Petunia, were lying in the shade of the hickory trees, their bellies full, their snouts muddy, their work done. Thomas fell to his knees beside his daughter. He reached out and touched the clover, his fingers sinking into soil that was soft and dark and rich, soil that smelled like life itself. He looked at Lila, and she looked at him, and neither of them could speak. "I told you," Lila finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I told you they were not ruining it. They were fixing it." Word spread through the county faster than the green had spread across the hill. By noon, the first truck had arrived. Joe, the farmer who had sold Lila the piglets, his eyes wide as he walked the paddock. By evening, there were 6 trucks, 12 farmers, and a reporter from the regional agricultural paper who had heard the rumors and come to see for himself. They walked the hillside in silence, touching the clover, smelling the soil, watching the bees. They looked at the pigs with new eyes, seeing not destroyers but creators, not ruin but renewal. Mr. Harrelson came on the 3rd day. He parked his pickup at the gate and walked to the field with his clipboard under his arm, his camera around his neck, his face set in the expression of a man who had come to document failure and found himself confronting success. He walked the fence line. He knelt in the clover. He dug his fingers into the soil and felt it crumble like cake, dark and rich and alive. He stood up and looked at Lila, who was standing beside Rosie, her hand on the pig's back, her face calm and knowing. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out rough, unused, like a door that had not been opened in years. "I have a master's degree from Purdue. I have been in conservation for 30 years. And I was wrong about your pigs, little girl. I was wrong about everything." Lila looked at him with eyes that held no triumph, only understanding. "You were not wrong about what pigs can do," she said. "You were wrong about what they want to do. My book said pigs like to dig, but it did not say they dig because they hate the land. They dig because they love it. They want to help it grow. We just have to let them." Mr. Harrelson nodded, his clipboard hanging useless at his side. "The extension office," he said slowly, "is going to want to study this. The university, the USDA. This changes things. This changes how we think about land restoration, about regenerative agriculture, about everything." Thomas put his arm around Lila's shoulders, his chest swelling with a pride that he had not felt in years. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick. "My 8-year-old daughter. She fixed what I could not. She saw what I was too afraid to see." By October, the hillside was a meadow. The clover had gone to seed, spreading itself across the remaining bare patches. The rye had been cut and baled, the first successful harvest from the back field in 15 years. The vetch had fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for whatever came next. And the pigs, their work complete, had been moved to a new section of the farm, where they began the process again on another dead field. Lila did not let the attention change her. She still woke at 6, still walked the fields with her notebook, still sang to the pigs while they rooted. But now she had visitors. Farmers from 3 counties who came to learn, to watch, to ask questions that she answered with the patience of someone who had always known the answers. She showed them the wallows, now ponds full of frogs and dragonflies. She showed them the soil, dark and rich and teeming with life. She showed them the pigs who had become local celebrities, their spotted faces appearing in newspapers and agricultural journals. On the first anniversary of Rosie's arrival, Lila stood at the top of the hillside at dawn, watching the mist rise off the green meadow below. The pigs were in their new paddock, visible as dark shapes in the gray light, already at work on the next field. Her father stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his heart full. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice soft, "used to say that the best farmers do not fight nature, they partner with it." I never understood what he meant. Until now, Lila leaned against him, her small body warm in the cool morning air. "The pigs are not nature," she said. "They are animals, but they know what nature wants. And nature wants to grow. It wants to be green. It wants to be alive. We just have to stop stopping it." The sun broke over the hills, turning the mist to gold, and the meadow below blazed with color, green and gold and purple, alive with bees and birds, and the quiet pulse of soil that had remembered how to breathe. Lila walked down the hillside, her boots sinking into the soft earth, her hand trailing through the clover. She reached the bottom and turned, looking back at the green slope that had once been dead, and she smiled the smile of someone who had never doubted, who had never wavered, who had known all along that ruin and renewal were just 2 words for the same thing. And somewhere in the town, Mr. Harrelson was sitting at his desk, rewriting the county's soil conservation guidelines, crossing out the words, "Pigs cause erosion," and replacing them with "managed pig rotation can restore degraded land." He thought about the little girl who had taught him more in 1 season than he had learned in 30 years, and he shook his head in wonder. The land speaks. Most people forgot how to listen, but Lila Crawford, who was 8 years old and stubborn and brave, had never forgotten. She had listened to the pigs. She had listened to the soil. And she had heard, beneath the warnings and the doubt and the certainty of experts, the quiet, patient voice of the earth saying, "Let me grow. Just let me grow.